Okay, Ryan, we're going to talk about the Department of Justice, but I want to start by asking you about your book, which everyone should buy. What's the story of the Sedition Hunters?
Essentially a bunch of average Americans who got together online, primarily Twitter, what is now X, before Elon, of course, bought it, and has done some interesting things with it since. But people organized very quickly and identified a lot of the rioters. So the way
the January 6th riot. It's a book about the investigation of the January 6th riot at the Capitol.
Exactly.
And you do what in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when the attack happened that I was very much in the mindset of like, this is going to take over my beat. Like I had all these ideas of what I was going to be covering in the Biden administration at DOJ. And then I just knew this was going to be this major investigation. As it turns out, I mean, I think it found it to be fascinating. I mean, it was the largest investigation in FBI history in terms of number of defendants involving, 1,500 people were charged. There could have been over 3,000 people charged, which is not something that they recognized when they went in, when they thought this was going to be about 800 cases, because they wildly underestimated how many people actually entered the Capitol itself that day. But the way I sort of got pulled in was, I was covering these cases, the initial ones as they came out. And I started hearing from people messaging me saying, hey, I sent this tip into the FBI. No one's gotten back to me. I haven't heard anything about it. And so the first couple of cases that I ended up covering were one individual who had assaulted officers with a fire extinguisher that day and had separately then done an interview on TV identifying himself by full name while wearing the same jacket that not a few minutes earlier he had been wearing when he assaulted an officer.
It took superb detective work to find that.
That was the least, I would say, that was not the most impressive of their finds. The facial, the other finds that they've gone through, in the year since, have been incredible. And one of the key ones, the second one I wrote a story about, was this individual named DJ Rodriguez. And he was someone who drove a stun gun into the neck of Officer Mike Fanone, who was one of the officers who was on TV. And it was testified during the January 6th committee hearing. So that was a tip that it was sitting with the FBI for about a month. And then finally we wrote about it. And then lo and behold, a month later, he was actually arrested, and they took him into custody. Ended up being sentenced to 12 and a half years in federal prison.
12 and a half years.
Yeah, one of the longer sentences. Yeah.
But not anymore.
Not anymore.
Okay, but we'll get to that. Talk about the scope of the investigation, both in terms of the FBI and the Justice Department, the prosecutors. How did this investigation proceed, and sort of what happened?
In the beginning days, it was a lot of the lowest hanging fruit. So it was the example of someone who just went on TV or had posted on social media and sort of bragged about it. And as the investigation went on, you got these sort of deeper and deeper cases. But the scope of this was very large. I mean, when you're talking about just the number of defendants and organizing all of those cases, and remember, everyone's scattered all across the country after the Capitol attack. So you're talking about people in all different field offices. Basically, every component of the FBI handled one of these cases, or every field office of the FBI handled one of these cases. Some of them more enthusiastically than others, I would say, because there was a lot of internal dissent about these cases.
Why? What was the internal dissent?
I think it varied. I mean, we get away from it now because Trump, I think, has convinced so many people that the FBI is just, was out to get him and that sort of thing. But primarily, the FBI is a conservative-leaning organization, and that's true of a lot of law enforcement organizations. And the FBI in particular is one where you get an advantage to get in if you're a member of the military, and that's a generally conservative leaning organization as well. I mean, it does not have great diversity stats, the FBI, and that's something that James Comey talked about at the time, really wanting to up the number of black agents, for example. It still is a predominantly, and disproportionately white and male bureau in comparison to the rest, what the makeup of the country is. So it is, I think, and also just on the, I think there is an overestimation of how good the FBI is on tech.
In rough numbers, how many FBI agents were involved in this, and how many prosecutors, Justice Department people?
Yeah, so I mean, the list that they apparently sent over is in the 5,000 to 6,000 range. And remember, because every one of these arrests that you execute would have to involve a line agent. It would have to involve a supervisor. There could be, someone who helped out execute an arrest, and sometimes that involves dozens of people for a lot of these really sort of worrisome riders that they're worried about there being, a threat for. So the number of people who are involved in some capacity is very large.
5,000 FBI agents out of, we did not prepare this. How many FBI agents are there?
It's a good question. There's not, I think that's roughly like a third, I want to say. Don't hold me strictly to that number.
Yeah, but I mean,
I think
it's a very significant number.
Right. Overall.
Yeah. And this is something that I'm a former assistant U.S. attorney, which interested me a lot because I know that the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, like most U.S. Attorney's offices, it's just not that big. Yeah. How did they handle suddenly 1,500 cases coming out of, just out of a single event?
It's a good question. That's why you're an expert at this. They had to bring in these assistant U.S. attorneys from around the country. And in the early days, remember, of the investigation, it's still during the pandemic. So this was kind of easy because people would just call in, or Zoom into a lot of these hearings. So you had people who were in Alaska. I remember there was one guy who the judge asked him, what time is it where you are? And I think it was, something like 4 a.m. or something at the time they were having this hearing, maybe 5. And so, these were people all over the country who sort of, put their hand up. And what a lot of them told me in the aftermath afterwards is that the reason that they got into these cases was to protect democracy, but the reason they stuck with these cases was to get justice for the officers. And I think that that's something that doesn't necessarily break through with the American public, because we hear from, I think there's 4 officers generally who most Americans maybe, or at least a solid chunk of Americans might know because they testified, but I would just walk into these courtrooms and it would be an officer who I'd never heard their name before, or maybe I'd only seen their initials in some document, just sort of laying their life out, and about what an awful day this was, the worst day of their lives in many cases. And a lot of those stories didn't really, I think, break through, at least in television media, right? Because it's all, there's no cameras in the courtroom, so this is all just me writing a story for online, or maybe talking about it on TV. But does it break through? And I think that was. And because there was just the high volume of these cases, I just don't think people recognize how large and how violent it was. Even in the B-roll, I think doesn't necessarily reflect just how bad the attack was on the west side of the U.S. Capitol.
So 1,500 cases. I think about half felony, half misdemeanor. Number of acquittals is
there was
2.
Yeah. Yes.
2.
And one of them was interesting because it was the judge who was like, who basically, it was this guy who had a security clearance who went in, and he's video recording, and there's like a smash window, there's an alarm going off, and I think the way the judge ended up phrasing it, I believe it was Judge Nichols was saying that, probably you knew that was going on, but it wasn't quite enough to get beyond reasonable doubt. And I mean, that was really the case in all these cases. It's just like the evidence was so overwhelming that, people can complain about the jury makeup of DC and all these sort of things. And I think the voir dire process filters for a lot of that and gets people out who were coming in with a bias. But, the evidence just was overwhelming here. And even in the Oath Keepers trial and the Proud Boys trial, while they convicted everyone, the juries did not convict everyone on every charge, right? And so I do think that you just had cases where jurors looked at the evidence, they looked at the law, and they made an informed decision based upon
and the judges approved the cases and sentenced the defendants, because judges in federal court and any court have the right to overrule the jury and say, this case shouldn't have been brought. Never happened. 2 acquittals out of 1,500 cases. What has happened to the investigators and to the Justice Department prosecutors since Donald Trump was inaugurated a couple of weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, so on Friday, less than a week ago, a number of January 6 prosecutors who were on probationary status, meaning that they hadn't gotten all of their full rights as they would have if they were there for over 2 years, were all fired. So Monday, I met up with a few of them as they walked in to turn in their computers, to gather their personal belongings. There was a young woman, a young prosecutor there whose dad stopped by with flowers, which was, I think, a nice little, gesture, because the key to this is that you have people just being sort of summarily fired without any actual allegation of wrongdoing, right? This isn't as though there was an internal investigation and there was a violation of someone's due process rights, or there was, evidence being hidden in some way. This is just people who literally just worked on cases because that's what they're hired to do by the US government, and then were fired because they worked on those cases involving people who Donald Trump decided shouldn't have been charged.
Cases they were assigned to prosecute,
Yes. Yeah.
cases which they prosecuted successfully,
Yeah.
and they have gotten fired.
Yeah.
What about on the investigative side and the FBI agents, the 5,000? What has happened to them?
So this is still, remember, so Pam Bondi was just confirmed. This is her first day, and there's still this back and forth right now between the FBI and DOJ about that list. So that list included
the list is what?
Of the FBI employees who were involved in January 6th. Which,
Now just talk about the compilation, the creation of this list, because the creation of such a list, at least to my knowledge, is unprecedented in the history of the FBI. What is this list?
Right.
Why was it created, and what is it, and what's it being used for?
So the acting Deputy Attorney General asked the FBI to create this list of anyone who was involved in these January 6 cases, and there's been some back and forth. The acting head of the FBI, a man nicknamed the Driz internally, who's become somewhat of a legend within the FBI within just, I think, recent history, because he sort of stood up to some of the actions that the Trump Justice Department was asking for. As sort of pushback at this, he sent out letters explaining what was going on behind the scenes to the entire FBI, all the FBI employees, explaining this isn't actually an allegation of wrongdoing. He said, I was on these cases, I worked these cases, because it impacted so many people in some way. I think the idea is that I think the chilling effect is really what's going to have this ultimate impact.
But has anything happened to those 5,000 agents yet?
Not yet. There had been firings at the top of the FBI, the supervisors, but rumor. This was,
And Chris Wray resigned rather
Right.
than be fired, the director. Yeah.
Exactly. And but this was the rumors that were spreading that we vetted and did not get in. But I remember hearing, you get these reports of I just heard all of these, these FBI employees were walked off the job, and none of that ended up turning out to be true. But the panic, I think that set off within the FBI was just enormous. And you've had agents who worked these cases and are back at their normal jobs, but just because they worked one of these cases are worried about now being on this list. And I think the chilling impact of that is going to last for years at the FBI.
Okay. The reason I began with this somewhat detailed questioning about the January 6th investigation is really as an introduction to the broader subject of the FBI, of the Department of Justice, of which the FBI is a part. What's going on? I mean, what is the Department of Justice doing in the second Trump administration?
Yeah, so this is Attorney General Pam Bondi's first day, and she's already sent out a memo saying that there's going to be an investigation or a look into the Jack Smith probe itself. And also and also in that memo mentioned the January 6th overlook, although she did use some sort of separate language. And you sort of see, remember Pam Bondi, before Trump did thed pardons, had told the Senate that she didn't think that pardons should be, she didn't think that individuals who assaulted police officers should be pardoned, which I think is probably something most Americans would agree with, broadly speaking. And Kash Patel sort of said the same thing, that pardons shouldn't go to people who assaulted officers. And so that's the entry point. And
but let's just pause.
Yeah.
Hundreds of people who assaulted police officers were pardoned.
Yeah.
There's a new book on this subject by me. So it's available
Pardons,
there
sedition
about
hunters,
pardons
we got
and all
this,
that. But we're here to talk about Ryan. Just so we're clear.
Yeah.
1,500 people were they've all been pardoned.
Yeah.
Every one of them, no matter how violent their actions. So that happened on Trump's first day in office. And now Pam Bondi has taken charge and says there's going to be investigation of the Jack Smith. what does that mean? What are they going to investigate Jack Smith for example?
I guess it depends on what you think the purpose of it is, right? I mean, I think it's sort of, going in with, I think they have a story that they're trying to tell, and they're going to figure out a way to tell it. Because I don't, if you look at the January 6 cases altogether, this was a huge success for the Justice Department in terms of, successfully prosecuting people who attacked the U.S. Capitol. And now the Supreme Court narrowed the scope of one of the charges that was brought against some of the defendants, and said that it shouldn't have applied to some of them, but that was still sort of being adjudicated down the line because some of the cases, it's too complicated to get into. But there was not I watched all of these trials. I watched way too many of these trials than any sane human should. And I mean, there just wasn't allegations of wrongdoing. In fact, I spoke with a defense attorney for some of the January 6ers just last week after all of this happened. And he was willing to write letters on behalf of anyone who was the prosecutors on these cases who were fired. And he was saying, that he would help them out. He sent a bunch of emails around and laid out how he said, we had our disagreements, but you always handled yourselves professionally, and you guys didn't do anything wrong.
But from a policy perspective, it's in the big picture of what the Justice Department does. Mm-hmm. What are they doing with the examination of these type issues? I mean, what is the Justice Department going to do about the previous 4 years of their own department?
It depends how cynical you want to be. I mean, I think we're
just talking about the range of possibilities.
I mean, the way this would typically work, if norms were standing, would be that the Inspector General, if there was an allegation of wrongdoing, would look at this. Or there's an internal office at DOJ, sort of has a special carve out for prosecutors. It's the Office of Professional Responsibility, where it's usually where investigations go to die, in terms of transparency purposes, because a lot of that is kept behind closed doors, and there's a lot of failures and issues with that process. But that's typically how it would adjudicate itself. It would be handled by professionals who know how these cases are handled in the past, if there were serious allegations of wrongdoing. But it wasn't as though judges were coming back and saying, I've identified this violation of this, the due process rights of this individual. That's not where this is originating. This is originating from an executive order from Donald Trump, who was really mad that a lot of his supporters got charged. And this was a guy who, remember, the parameters of this investigation were set out by a Trump appointee. The way that this all happened in those days between January 6th and January 20th of 2021 was that a guy who was appointed by Donald Trump was in charge and sort of set how we're going to handle this. And they largely stuck with that plan. And what they decided in those initial days, although they didn't really publicly articulate this until months later, really, and through court proceedings, but what they decided is that anybody who entered the Capitol was eligible for a charge. They used their prosecutorial discretion there, because theoretically you could have charged a lot of people who were outside. Those cases would have been more complicated. But generally, entering the threshold of the Capitol was what would trigger a charge, typically misdemeanors, unless there's some sort of extra conduct there, and then anyone who assaulted an officer. And I think that most people would probably agree those were reasonable parameters, because especially if you entered the Capitol, you have to remember all of the warning signs that you went through. You went through all this tear gas, right? You went through these police lines that were falling down. You took over the inauguration platform. You think you're just allowed to walk on the inauguration platform? No. So I think that that's is sometimes lost in the coverage of this, because there's been such a propaganda effort to sort of identify, I guess, victims of the Justice Department here. And I just don't think that one thing that really breaks through with the American public when I hear a question about, this, what about this MAGA granny or yada yada? Okay, but what was their actual punishment in the end? And in so many of these cases, people were getting probationary sentences. So many of the cases.
But I mean, let's just talk big picture here. Why is this investigation taking place at all?
Yeah, because
when has it ever happened in the history of the Justice Department that a very successful set of prosecutions leads to an investigation of the people who led that and multiple firings? Has anything like this ever happened before?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I think this is kind of a really remarkable set of circumstances here, and it's all happening because that's what Donald Trump wants to happen, right? That was in the executive order. And the barriers between DOJ, I mean, the sort of post-Watergate norms that we all focus on, and that was something that Attorney General.
Which are what roughly?
It's basically the contact policy between DOJ and the White House, and the idea is that the Justice Department shouldn't be taking direct prosecutorial decisions or making decisions in criminal cases at the direction of the White House, right? Where the White House can influence policy, broadly speaking, at DOJ and say, we want there to be a focus on these types of cases. They're not supposed to be getting into the nitty-gritty details of individual cases and intervening when they're.
But that's a policy, that's a norm, right. That's not a law.
Correct,
right.
And I think that's. It's disappearing. I think I think policing that line is going to be one of my journalists' main duties over the next several years, and identifying clearly when there's political interference in ongoing criminal cases, which in this case, there was. There's no question of that. The only reason that these cases, it's completely his right, obviously. I heard there's a great book about the pardon process coming, it's coming out next week. That's his.
Word on the street, yes.
Word on the street. But that's his right under the, right? So, and that was a fascinating thing too, talking to a lot of these prosecutors who are now, some of them former prosecutors, is that they all recognize, and a lot of them had to sign these documents dismissing these cases against individuals who they knew were guilty.
Because of the pardon.
Because of the pardon, right? And so they had to dismiss these cases, and that's what they were ordered to do. And they did that because they knew that's allowed under the Constitution. But I had them, one person described it to me as just having a guttural reaction to having to do that, because they knew for a fact that these individuals were guilty in some cases, who had been convicted already, or in other cases who the evidence is just so completely overwhelming, and you have multiple angles of, this awful attack on an officer, and then having to abandon those individuals. The one moment that really stuck out to me is Mike Fanone called me right after all these pardons took place, and told me he just got off the phone with a victim service advocate within DOJ, who told him that in the eyes of DOJ, he was no longer a victim. And that line to me, I'm just okay, Orwell's doing a little too much, right?
Yeah,
It's okay, it's we get it. Pump the brakes here on the, yeah.
Talk about what this means going forward in terms of how prosecutors and investigators, FBI agents, look to the cases that they are assigned to prosecute in the future. What will this mean for how cases are investigated, at least for the next 4 years, if not indefinitely?
Yeah, so I think a good, I think it's going to have a chilling effect. I think that, the idea that you're going to want to touch anything to do with any of the president's allies in any remote aspect right now, good luck, right? You're kind of putting your career on the line, even if you were able to get that approved up the chain of command. It's been a very clear signal sent that we don't want these people prosecuted. And that's just the reality of it. Throughout my career, it's been maybe this is, I think with the judges, there had always been this tendency to not associate judges with, the person who appointed them. But in this, in this realm now, I think sometimes that does play a role. Certainly if you look at the Mar-a-Lago case, the judge, the Trump-appointed judge who was involved there has, I think made some decisions that there's widespread agreement were kind of outside of the bounds there, and she was, overturned in some instances. And so I think that it's just sort of changed overall what we think of in terms of when we think of the Justice Department.
Well, and how it works. I guess one of the things that is, I was an assistant U.S. attorney, as I mentioned, in the 90s, and one of the things that I felt as a line prosecutor, I was not a policymaker, I was a line assistant, is that the work that the Justice Department did was largely apolitical. That I happen to do public corruption cases in New York City, so there were New York City is mostly Democrats, so we mostly investigated Democrats, but I didn't have a sense that I knew that my boss, the U.S. attorney, was a presidential appointee and someone who but the idea of line prosecutors, being held accountable for policy decisions made by superiors was not something that even occurred to me. And now here you have these AUSAs losing their jobs because they did their jobs and they did them well enough to get convictions, which stood appeal if they were appealed. And what does it mean for you as a prosecutor knowing that your behavior in office could mean what it did for these prosecutors?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really huge impact, because if you have, I always hear this refrain from former AOSAs and current AOSAs who I've spoken with, is that my client's the American people, right? That's what the approach that you take to this job. You're not the president's lawyer. Contrast that with the new interim head of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, tweeting out or posting that, referring to federal prosecutors as the president's lawyers. And that's just not the tradition of the Justice Department, or at least post-Watergate. And so the question is now, is that the mentality, and is that the message that they are sending, is that you work for Donald Trump?
And if anything, I would think it's more, there's an even greater impact on the FBI and investigators generally, because by the time you as a prosecutor get involved, there is an investigation already underway, or you are in at an early stage. But ultimately, it's the investigators, it's the FBI or the DEA or the postal inspectors or whatever law enforcement agency it is. They have their sources and they decide what to investigate, and there is tremendous discretion there.
Yeah.
Like you can decide to investigate drug dealers or the mafia or political corruption.
Yeah.
Who in their right mind is going to investigate political corruption or anything touching on the political interest of the White House if this is these are the consequences you might face?
It's a clear message, I think, that's being sent. I will say, I think that's generally, you're correct generally about this notion that, when the prosecutor gets involved, that's when sort of that stage. That is typically the norm. I think one thing that we're going to see a lot of in this investigation of the investigators is complaints basically that these cases were being driven from DC. Often you had FBI people out in the field who were signing off on these affidavits that were mostly driven by DC. And so I think that that's something that I would expect there to be some...
Driven by DC, like so?
Right. I mean,
that's like what supervisors do.
Right.
They say, go investigate a case.
Right. I think that that's what you're going to, so there's this whole network of sort of right-wing FBI agents, and I wrote a story actually about this, I guess it was probably a week and a half ago, sort of this idea of people who were in Kash Patel's ear. And there's, one of them is named Kyle Seraphin. He now has his own podcast. His dad was a radio host, so he's got like a really good skill set. He's a very effective communicator, and he had some issues with the COVID mandate during the pandemic, and so he's got this whole sort of group that was set up within the FBI where they all communicate via Signal. And they all talk about their issues with COVID mandates. And that network that he's sort of created off of that, I think, has also had a huge impact on and he talks directly to Kash. In fact, the day that Kash Patel was named the nominee to be director of the FBI, one of his first calls was to Kyle Seraphin and these two other quote-unquote, suspendables, as they call themselves, because they were all suspended by the FBI at some point. And so I think that that's the network that they're tapping into. And their contention, I think, is that the FBI overstepped when it came to January 6th, that a lot of people within the FBI saw this as their 9/11, that they wanted to, build their careers and build cases off of this, and that they overreached. And I think that, there's a varying degree of those agents and how they actually believe in these cases. Kyle, for example, I spoke with him a lot, and he, is someone who thinks that someone who assaulted a cop should be charged, but also thinks that the FBI overreached on this. Whereas you also have some people in that contingent who refused in any way to be involved in January 6 cases and thought that all of the cases should be tossed out. And it's a reminder that I think, the FBI is susceptible to the same sort of, I think, propaganda and misinformation and disinformation that the American public is in general, because you saw in some instances where there was an FBI analyst who was pushing stuff from like Gateway Pundit and all sort of like right-wing news organizations.
Just the idea that the FBI is this, Marxist institution is that, I don't want to put my, assume too much, but if I am a sort of Marxist revolutionary, my career path is unlikely to lead to being a special agent of the FBI. And I worked with these agents when I was in AUSA, and I've covered some as a journalist. And, these are very straight arrow folks, and they are not, they did not get into this job for political reasons. And, if I had to guess how they voted, they would all be, it would be a lot more Republican than the general population. So the idea that the FBI was some sort of nest of the resistance is beyond bizarre. Before we leave this subject, what options are available to the people who are fired and the FBI agents who haven't been fired yet, but the prosecutors who have been fired? Is there any remedy?
Yeah, I mean, the Jack Smith prosecutors, I think, have the easiest sort of case. The question is whether or not, I do think that the public threats are a big part of this. And if you sign yourself up for a lawsuit, first of all, now all your names are out there. Kind of right now, there's maybe a couple of names that are really closely associated with this investigation because they are on court documents and whatnot. But I think if there was some sort of lawsuit, then all of a sudden all of these names are out there, unless they do it in some sort of Jane Doe or John Doe sort of scenario and not use their names. But I don't know how far that's going to take you. I think that they have a solid case, but remember, it's like, taxpayers are going to be on the hook for that down the line. I don't think DOJ is going to settle it for the next 4 years at least. And so when you actually, how much effort is that worth when, you got to pick another job at that point. The damage has already been done, and that's what happened during the Trump administration.
I'd like to take some questions from the audience. Just think about what you want to ask, but before we get to that, let's just step aside from the sort of January 6th type cases. As you report, every Justice Department has certain priorities, as they should. Sometimes it's white collar crime, sometimes it's insider trading, sometimes it's organized crime, sometimes it's narcotics. What do you think this Justice Department will put its investigative efforts into?
I think the things that Donald Trump has talked about, and we should say Pam Bondi has a more traditional background than a lot of the other people that we're seeing. She does have experience as the Attorney General of Florida, right? And whatever any gripes folks have with her, it's within, I think, the realm of normalcy. Matt Gaetz would not have been within the realm of normalcy. Typically, people who are investigated for federal sex trafficking crimes are not, first on the list.
To be Attorney General of the United States.
General of the United
You're really
States.
going out on a limb there, Reilly, aren't you?
That was
that's
actually one of the prosecutors who and she's spoken out publicly, so I can name her now, Ashley Akers, who's been on a few shows and talking about this after she left the Justice Department. The Matt Gaetz point was her breaking point. When he was named, she was like, I'm out, that's it. I'm like, nope, can't do it anymore, gone. I think that we're going to find where a lot of people's lines are over the next 4 years, how much they can tolerate, what they can do. But a lot of that has to do with what, their next job is going to be. And right now, in DC, a lot of lawyers already in DC. And, how many legal jobs are there out there for, assistant U.S. attorneys who don't feel as though the Justice Department is acting in an ethical manner? And
in my experience, assistant U.S. attorneys, the job they want is to be assistant U.S. attorneys.
Yes.
And it's a great job. It is an absolutely great job, and I am so proud to have done it, and the opportunity, and it never got old for me, is to, to walk into a courtroom and say, this is Jeffrey Toobin for the United States. It's like, it was thrilling to me every time I said it. And part of what made it thrilling is that you had no obligation in that courtroom and in your office work except to try to do the right thing. As you understood it and as your supervisors, and it was not something that had any political content, at least that I was aware of, and that's something that certainly seems to be gone. Can we take some questions? Raise your hand, and I'll repeat the question for others. The question is, does Ryan feel like there's a bullseye in the Southern District? Just to elaborate for those of you who are not insiders, the U.S. Attorney's offices are divided up into districts. Some whole states are just one district, but the New York City, the Southern District of New York, is the district that includes Manhattan, the Bronx, and Westchester. I was an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York, which was Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk, and we thought the Southern District were a bunch of arrogant assholes, and we wanted to kick their ass all the time. But I digress.
EDNY is more like Americans, like true Americans.
Historically, the Southern District has operated with a measure of independence of the main Justice Department, sometimes nicknamed the Sovereign District of New York.
I stole
so
my line.
What do you think? What do you think is going to happen to this SDNY?
I mean, I definitely think that's a big target overall. But right now, Ed Martin in D.C. Being he's a person who represented January 6th defendants. He was on the grounds of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th itself. He's a Stop the Steal advocate who gave a speech on January 5th about how they needed to keep fighting to overturn the election. And now he's in charge he's the top prosecutor in D.C. And I should say, one thing that, I think that if this was a competition between the coolest district for AUSA is what the people from DC would say is that, DC is unique in that it's the only jurisdiction where you also prosecute not only federal crimes, but local crimes. So that means you're both in federal court, in US District Court, and you're in Superior Court. So, your average, mugging on the street is being prosecuted by federal prosecutors in Superior Court, which, as a DC resident, there's some issues with how, basically all of America gets to decide how the law is enforced in the District of Columbia specifically, regardless of what the voters think of it.
Now, one point about the Southern District that I think it has given some people a measure of hope is that the nominee to be U.S. Attorney, I'm blanking on his name, he's the former head of the SEC, he's a partner at Sullivan and Cromwell. He's someone who is known as a real lawyer and someone who is known not as a political activist. Martin, who is, behaving, I think it's safe to say, in a very bizarre and very partisan way, he has not yet been nominated to be the U.S. Attorney there. He may yet be, but the people I know in the Southern District have taken a measure of comfort from, and I'm blanking on the guy's name, but from that nominee. But who knows? Another question? Yes. The question is, just so I can repeat it so everybody, is Ryan fearful that there's a bullseye on you? And if you want to broaden that, on journalists generally.
Yeah, when a bunch of people were pardoned, some of whom blame their cases on me, it's not a great, feeling. And I think I'm kind of like a stand-in, because I wrote the book Sedition Hunters, right? So for a lot of the online sleuths who are all anonymous right now, I think that's some of that heat has sort of transferred over to me. So it's definitely something I've taken precautions about. But it's kind of just the reality that we're in, where there's a bunch of people who were convicted or were seen on video assaulting people who are now out and can sort of do what they want. So it's definitely, something I've been clocking.
One of the issues, and this came up when Obama was president in particular, less so under Biden, leak investigations and getting reporters to reveal their sources. What do you think the future of that is?
Signal, I think is the future of that.
Everybody
it's an encrypted app.
moves to using Signal. Yeah.
It's like this encrypted app that a lot of it's interesting because a lot of the Proud Boys used it, right? And now it's also something that's very popular amongst people within the federal government and former people within the federal government because there's that worry about making those connections. So yeah.
Yes.
I'm from Washington. I'm a physicist, not a lawyer, but I'm really perplexed why we've seen very little reporting about who the White House has nominated for the number 2 and the number 3 position at justice. I understand they're both lawyers of the president.
Right. Well,
Tell me more about why.
Well, the number 2 and 3 lawyers it's actually certainly a number 2 lawyer. I don't think the other guy is 3 technically, but it's up there. Are lawyers who represented Trump in the case in front of the district attorney's case in Manhattan, the Stormy Daniels case. Also, Alina, what's her name? Alina, last name? Alina. The lawyer who represented Trump in the sexual assault cases and the defamation. She has a big job in the White House as counselor to the president. I mean, I'm always a little skeptical. I mean, not skeptical, but these questions are like, well, why didn't you report X? I mean, we have reported X, but people don't care. I mean, or people don't. I mean, it is. These are facts that are out there public, but one of the Steve Bannon talks about Trump needed to flood the zone with news, and he has flooded the zone with news, and it's been a real challenge for people who are trying in good faith to report what's going on. You have to pick like what to cover, and if the president says we're going to take over Gaza, that takes a lot of energy and time to cover that, and we're going to have 25% tariffs on Mexico, and except then we're not. I mean, it's all there's just a limited amount of news you can cover. Anyway, I did
a deep dive on John Lauro, so I recommend reading that. He's the DAG nominee. And what was interesting is even though, which sounds strange in the world we're living in, that this idea of the president's lawyer being appointed to this big spot, but you actually had some people who are relatively speaking, he's kind of a normie, a normal, nominee. He has the background, right? It's not so because I think Matt Gaetz moved the goalposts, right, so much down the line where you're just okay, he's not Matt Gaetz. It's kind of now the new standard for a lot of these, positions.
As George W. Bush liked to say, it's the soft bigotry of low expectations. Yes, sir. I think this is an incredibly important question, which I will repeat. I know, it's hard to hear. Is that, a lot of people believe that under President Biden, the Department of Justice was weaponized into what's sort of known colloquially as lawfare, that it was used to punish the president and his allies politically. And that's why there are these investigations of Jack Smith and what about that?
I mean, I've had a number of people, ask me sort of about that before, and I think that it's been a very effective talking point, and that's that the president has been able to institute, and that's what people, really do believe. But whenever I try to press people and go into details on this, I'm just okay, but what specifically or what stage? And very quickly, they run out of what their point about it is going to be. Like, for Georgia, for example, that was not the federal government. That was, that was a separate sort of case involving state prosecutor. Same thing with the New York case. But the Jack Smith case, I would say, like, it was a little bit of a novel legal theory that would have played itself out. But Jack Smith, what other cases did he go for back? He went hard against public corruption cases throughout his career. This was not unique to Donald Trump. This was not unique to just Republicans, right? This was an individual who's, would grab something and get a hold of it and was very anti-public corruption. And so I think he used what he, the sort of a novel legal.
And if I can elaborate on that, the fact that he brought a case based on an attempt to overthrow the results of a presidential election, I think there was a lot of merit to that case, and it was a worthwhile investigation. The other case he brought involved the classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, also a case that is fairly conventional in terms of how the Justice Department handles classified information issues. But you are certainly correct in raising this issue because politically, this is what is driving the kind of investigations that Ryan was talking about. They are vigilant here at this wonderful festival in respecting time limits. We are out of time. Please join me in thanking Ryan.